Hello, I'm Dr. Usha Tummala-Narra, and I'm an associate professor in counseling, developmental, and educational psychology at Boston College. My areas of interest and expertise involve immigration, the psychology of immigration, and of trauma. Today, I will be talking with you about identity issues related to foreign-born students, and particularly how the immigration process, both pre-migration as well as post-migration, affects young people, particularly children and adolescents, and their acculturation, as well as some of the challenges, as well as some of the opportunities that young people experience in the United States. So the topic today will focus on identity and the motivations, the psychology of foreign-born students. So with that, I will move forward. Just as a background, there's approximately today about 38.5 million foreign-born individuals in the United States. We are a land of native peoples as well as immigrants and refugees. And you may be aware that there are also several waves of immigrants within each immigrant subgroup in the United States. So for example, someone who has migrated from India in the 1970s to the United States may have a very different experience compared with somebody from India who migrates in the 1990s or more recently into the 2000s. For example, the use of the internet or the access to the internet has really revolutionized for many immigrants the ways that they can access home or people from the country of origin, such as extended family, relatives, and friends. That is one example. Of course, in the case of refugees and immigrants who come to the United States with far fewer resources may not access that same kind of presence of the country of origin. So there are variations in terms of when somebody arrives to the United States. We also have variations in immigration status. We have approximately 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States today. And the documentation status may change as a function of living in the US. And I'll go through some details related to that in just a few moments. There are many reasons, different kinds of reasons for why people choose to immigrate, and including looking for work, environmental catastrophes, trauma, political persecution, but also for family reunification. And let me go through this in a little bit more detail. So we look at the context of why children and adolescents might immigrate, sometimes with their parents, sometimes without their parents or family members. And if you look at this, you see that the search for work, employment, is of course a key issue for families. And immigrants are involved in a variety of different kinds of industries in the United States: manufacturing, agriculture, service, knowledge, and in fact, a growing number of professionals, as well as a growing number of individuals involved with agriculture and service. War and humanitarian crises. We see this more and more. We have alarming rates of internal displacement within countries, but certainly also exile and refugee experiences due to war, persecution, but also due to environmental catastrophes, natural disasters. You see here in the slide the floods in Pakistan years ago. But the biggest reason and the most common reason for why people migrate actually involves the wish to reunify with family, to live near family, sometimes with parents, sometimes with children. And we have a growing number of older adults moving to the United States to live with their children and their grandchildren, and often many of them become caretakers for those grandchildren. We also have a growing population of children of immigrants. So these are either children who are born outside of the United States or born in the United States to immigrant parents. So if we look at the picture of who the children of immigrants are today, the vast majority, over 80%, are citizen children. They're first and second generation, first referring to foreign-born, second referring to those children born in the United States, raised completely in the US. If you look at the breakdown a little bit further, we have about 4.5 million children who are citizens of an unauthorized parent. So we have this issue that many families contend with that have to do with mixed documentation, where family members may or may not realize that other family members have documentation, or their documentation has expired, they have overstayed the visa. Sometimes children don't find out until much later into their development that their parents or one of their parents is not documented. There's also children and parents and adults, other adults in the home, that have ambiguous status, where they are in process of waiting for authorized status in the United States, or they hold a temporary status. So what this presents is a lot of unknown, a lot of anxiety within the family and certainly within the child. Sometimes it's not spoken about explicitly, but nonetheless it is felt, it's absorbed psychologically by family members, and there tends to be some vigilance around interacting with those people who are outside of the family and within systems, including schools, and certainly with other authorities. There are also now approximately 1 million unauthorized children and adolescents. So you can see that this would present an entirely different kind of psychological experience for someone with unauthorized status versus somebody who is a citizen child. I want to just talk for a few minutes about the context from which children and adolescents migrate from. You know, one of the things we have to consider, there's several things to consider, but certainly one has to do with thinking about why youth migrate in the first place. So I just went through a number of different reasons for why people migrate, but the circumstances from which they migrate can have a lasting impact on their process of adjustment in the new cultural context and also in their identity development. So if a child is moving to be close to a parent, or if a child is moving because the family has lived in poverty, and a different child who is moving because a parent is seeking out better educational opportunity but has lived in a middle class or an upper middle class background in the country of origin, all of these different factors and these very different circumstances can have unique impact on the immigration trajectory once the family or the child relocates to the United States or to the new country. Another factor that one should consider in thinking about the process of a migration for youth has to do with the nature of the pre-migration context. Was it a time and a place in which the child had access to support, to family or to friends, or was it a chaotic context? In fact, coming to the United States may actually provide more structure than what was provided in the country of origin. Now that varies tremendously from child to child and even within subgroups of people, subgroups of immigrants. So we can't assume necessarily that migration experience is the same for each individual, even if they're coming from the same country or the same region within that country. Another factor to think about has to do with the separation that children and adolescents experience through the separation from family. So if in fact the child had a significant type of support from grandparents, relatives, and friends, that separation can cause tremendous anxiety, sadness, sometimes depression, and then all of a sudden finding yourself in an unfamiliar context, where in fact oftentimes immigrants describe the United States as a fairly lonely place where they don't have that informal kind of interaction that they would most likely have had back in the country of origin. So just the social atmosphere itself makes for a very different kind of experience psychologically. So, which brings me to the next point related to the separation from familiar social, cultural, and linguistic context. So the ability to speak one's language, heritage language, and feel as though you can communicate effectively but also comfortably makes for a very different kind of feeling. Now, aside from all of these different factors, immigrant children and youth most often come to the United States with a sense of hope, the sense of hope for a better future for oneself and for one's family. And also all kinds of images about the new cultural context. Sometimes people have access to the internet or media that exposes them to what life in the United States is supposed to look like. And often those images can be informative, but they can also be somewhat distortive, where the child or the adolescent imagines a certain type of world that they're moving into. So oftentimes there's a sense of hope, sadness, a mixed set of feelings coming to the United States. So let's look at the post-migration context. That's the pre-migration context I just spoke about. Now if we think about what is it like when a child or an adolescent moves to the US or to a new country. First of all, it's very important to think about migration as typically not involving just that child or adolescent, but really oftentimes migration is felt to be a family or a collective kind of experience where the child is seeing changes occurring with every person within their family structure or their support structure, that it's not just necessarily something that they think about for themselves. There's also the sense of hope that I mentioned earlier, and this sense of optimism coexists with a sense of disorientation, the lack of familiarity, and then later, as time goes on, sometimes even disillusionment, where the child doesn't feel as though this is what the family imagined. And it's not just the child alone, but in fact, the parents may experience that, siblings may experience that, and that can vary within families as well. I do want to mention that sometimes in certain circumstances, children live away from their parents. The parents migrate first, and the children join them later. In those cases, particularly when there have been long-term separations between the parents and the children, children and adolescents, and particularly when the child arrives later on as an adolescent, it can be particularly difficult for them to develop a sense of belonging within the family as well as outside of the family. And particularly as they have to negotiate separation from grandparents or other relatives who have been taking care of them, whom they've built a very strong attachment to, unlike that with their parents, whom they've been separated from for a considerable period of time. Sometimes kids also feel a responsibility of translating for parents or other relatives, both linguistically, if the parent is not proficient in English or not comfortable talking in English, but also culturally, they're translating what it means to be a young person in the US or to be an American. So oftentimes they become cultural and linguistic translators. And this is not necessarily always a negative thing, but it is a feeling of responsibility nonetheless. Sometimes this feels like a positive thing that the child is making a contribution to the family who is adjusting. And at the same time, it can feel like a source of stress as well. There are many different trajectories as a function of living in this new post-migration context, both regarding education as well as socio-emotional development. One of the things I just want to mention briefly is just when students who have partial schooling in their country of origin and then arrive to the United States and then sort of develop depending on the age they arrive in the US, they develop either a strong connection to their school or feel as though they don't quite belong in the school, or it's an unfamiliar educational system. These experiences can vary tremendously. When you have interrupted education, for example, there are many foreign-born students who, before they arrived to the United States, may have had years of not having any exposure to schooling at all because they are working, or they're taking care of younger siblings at home. And so in those cases, our schools are typically not equipped to address the concerns of those long periods of time sometimes that kids have with interruptions in their schooling, which of course then becomes challenging when trying to pursue higher education in the United States later. There's also a set of concerns related to socio-emotional development, and of course, related to that is a sense of belonging, trying to figure out how to make friends and what it takes to make friends in their new school here, and trying to figure out what their identity is. How do they negotiate their loyalty to the country of origin? How do they negotiate their feelings of belonging here? And how can they have both present at the same time without feeling as though that they have to give up one versus the other? And when there are conflicts in these areas, oftentimes kids may experience psychological symptoms such as anxiety, depression, withdrawal, sometimes engage in substance use, substance abuse, these kinds of issues. So I had mentioned that the context of reception is a part of the post-migration experience. So how are the kids, if you think about their trajectories, whether educationally or socially or emotionally, we have to also consider what is the context that they are coming into. And in this present, current socio-political environment in the United States. And this model is called the Socio-ecological model, developed by Uri Bronfenbrenner. And I won't go through the whole model, but this basically describes the various levels of an individual's ecological context, where the individual is in constant interaction with these various layers, such as the microsystem, which is the family, the school environment. These are the day-to-day kinds of places of interaction that an individual experiences. And then followed the next layer involving the mesosystem, which is the connection between these different microsystems. Like for example, how do the parents or the guardians interact with the school? That's one example of the mesosystem. And then we have the larger exosystem, which involves policies that guide a family's life or an individual's life. Like, for example, what is the availability of childcare? What are the parents' work hours? And then you have the macro system, the larger layer that has to do with the ways in which immigrants are perceived. What are some of the larger, broader kinds of reception experiences? And then you'll see an arrow at the bottom. This refers to the chronos system, which has to do with the time and developmental kinds of tracking for students. For example, how does the loss of a parent or separating from loved ones from a country of origin affect somebody who is a young child versus an adolescent? That this is our dimension of the ecological system that interacts, that has to do with a child's developmental stage and how that can affect all of these different ecological experiences. So if we look at the macro system, which I just described, the larger reception of immigrants in the United States, these are some prevailing stereotypes of immigrants that we need to consider, that these are what foreign-born children and adolescents are coming into a broader system that embraces these stereotypes. So one has to do with illegal immigration overwhelming the nation. So you see here a fence, and on one side is the United States, the other side is Mexico. And in Mexico, you see this cartoon that shows maps to the United States, and you see a whole more number of people who have snuck underneath this fence to make it into the United States, where there are free jobs, free healthcare, free education, and all kinds of things that people are hoping to secure in their life. We also see images of stampedes, that people are just running and racing to the United States any which way they can. And that, again, there's a sense of being taken over by the foreigners or the outsiders. There's also a stereotype that immigrants are taking the jobs of real Americans. Another one has to do with the image of terrorism and the image of immigrants as frightening or criminal. Then, the idea that immigrants are changing the rest of everybody's lives, that they're changing our lives, and why should I have to adjust to these new immigrants from different countries that I'm unfamiliar with, or different cultural contexts that I'm unfamiliar with. So you see here in this photo, you see the American flag and this individual saying, why the hell should I have to press 1 for English? So again, this kind of xenophobia and fear of the unknown, and fear of also having to adjust for other people who are perceived as outsiders. And so when you think about a young person coming to the U.S., we have to think about what messages are they receiving from a very young age. And this is very critical to the issue of identity development and to the mindset of the immigrant student within the school system as well. So when we think about the context, this moves us into considering what acculturation looks like and feels like to young people. And in this photo here, you see an Indian immigrant family who, this is from the movie, which was based on the book, Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri. And for those of you who have seen it perhaps or read the book, this is a depiction of a family who is on a visit to India, their ancestral home, where you see the father and the mother who are immigrants to the United States. They live in New Jersey, and their children were born and raised in the United States. And in this photo, the family has gone back to a visit to India, and they're facing the Taj Mahal, which we of course cannot see in this photo, but they're looking at the Taj Mahal and in really a deep sort of sense of awe and admiration. But you can see within the family, just based on how they're dressed in terms of the parent generation, the child generation, how each member within a family can have very different experiences of acculturation. So the mother, the father here, the daughter, and the son have very different internal and external experiences with adjusting and living in the United States. And this is a very common experience for immigrant homes where, oftentimes people are independently kind of adjusting to their world outside. And largely these experiences are unspoken within the family, so that even though you have a family living together, they're not necessarily talking openly about what's happening in school, what's happening at work or in their neighborhood or in their communities, and what kinds of struggles they may be going through. Partly because children oftentimes don't want to burden their parents. They already see their parents oftentimes struggling, either financially, culturally, and oftentimes parents are engaged with their struggles, and they're hoping for a better future for their children, but not necessarily in tune always with what their children's psychological experiences might be. So acculturation, I won't go through everything on this particular slide, but just as a point to make here, that acculturation is a dynamic process. This is a process that's lifelong. And so across the developmental lifespan, we expect that children, adolescents, adults, older adults are constantly adjusting and rethinking and re-experiencing different kinds of feelings, different kinds of thoughts about living in the United States, being here, a sense of belonging that's constantly being negotiated, and which also can be quite stressful at times. We refer to the term acculturative stress to refer to the stress that's related to the process of this adjustment. And we do know that the more stress that someone experiences, that this is linked to psychological outcomes and mental health outcomes. We also know that discrimination is a very critical component of acculturative stress. And immigrants of color, remember the prevailing stereotypes that I showed you earlier. These stereotypes are often of immigrants of color in particular, as our immigration trends have shifted in the United States to largely immigration from Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and more recently Africa. We see that these immigrants from these regions of the world tend to experience discrimination in a very different kind of way than immigrants who arrive from European countries or are white or perceived as white people in the US. I do want to move to talking a bit about family acculturation. I mentioned earlier that each individual within a family system can have very different acculturation experiences. But I want to point out a couple of ways in which this can lead to some gaps within the family system that has implications also for the school system. We refer to acculturation gaps when we talk about the fact that oftentimes parents may be oriented towards a heritage culture, whereas children may be oriented to a new or host culture. That children often are more engaged with developing a multicultural identity, a sense of belonging in the United States in a way that's distinct from that of their parents who have already developed an identity in their country of origin. So oftentimes this leads to gaps in communication, challenges in having conversations with each other, misunderstandings. But please remember that this is related to this acculturative stress that they're each experiencing. It is not a cultural problem, it's a problem of acculturation. And so parents may have difficulties with understanding the child's experience, communicating with schools. Sometimes parents have very different ideas of what the school's role is than what the school imagines that the parent should be doing. So in the United States, for example, we're very used to the idea of parents being volunteers in their schools, becoming involved with the Parent-Teacher Association, responding in ways that are, that indicate an interest to the teachers, the personnel at school. However, for many parents who come from very different cultural and educational systems of thought, they may feel that, in fact, it's the teacher's job or the school's job to really take care of the educational aspect of their child's life, and they don't necessarily understand that the parents may have a very different role. They may also have some difficulties around determining an appropriate level of autonomy and supervision within the new cultural context. They may feel as though they need to monitor their children in certain ways that are challenging for the child, since that child may then compare themselves to someone, another child who does not have immigrant parents who have the same cultural values. So one result of this is that children may not turn to parents with their problems. They might see the parents as an obstacle. They may also see the parent as a support in other circumstances also. So here you see, this picture here, this photo shows this kind of tension between a mother and a daughter around different expectations, around her independence, her sense of growing autonomy, particularly in adolescence. Recently, I conducted a study with some of my graduate students that involved some adolescents in a local high school, which is an urban setting, a very diverse, culturally diverse, economically diverse high school student body. And we interviewed about 64 adolescents, 35 girls, 29 boys, who attended 9th through 12th grade. The majority of them were 9th and 10th graders. And we asked them about their identity. We asked them about how they saw themselves as an immigrant origin a person who is a high school student. What's it like in your school environment and in your life? Tell us about what you feel positively about and what feels challenging. And I just want to read to you a few of the quotes from these students that I think illustrate some of the points I'm making about acculturation, but specifically what they experience within the school context and in their neighborhoods. So the first in this, when we analyzed our interview data, and these interviews were conducted in focus groups, and what we found are several themes, and I'll describe to you a quote that illustrates each of these themes. The first theme that you see here is pride in heritage, culture, and language. And here you have a Cuban American student who says the following: I feel really proud of being Latina because I remember after 9/11, a lot of people went to help clean up the city. The most people who went to help were Latinos. That made me feel very proud because we Latinos like to be together in harmony and help each other. And we heard this from every group, every focus group, where students talking about their sense of pride in their communities. This was very critical. Difficulties in cultural adjustment. Alongside this sense of pride were some challenges, such as the following. I didn't have enough friends when I first moved here because I was different from them. I didn't know any English, so I couldn't communicate to my classmates. So this is a very common kind of experience. The next one from a Sri Lankan American participant: my mom doesn't know that much English, so whenever she needs help with English, I need to help her, like make phone calls and stuff. My brother used to do that, but now he's in college, and so I have to do it now. We also see this example of intergenerational conflicts. This is from a Haitian American participant who stated they're really strict, referring to his parents. Haitian parents are strict. I just want to have American parents sometimes because it would be easier. So there's this kind of fantasy that it would be easier not to be an immigrant, even though alongside of this, again, is that sense of connection with one's culture and family and community. Another challenge had to do with stereotypes and discrimination. There are many, many different kinds of stereotypes that I could list here from this study that the participants shared with us, and many of them were specific to ethnic groups and racial groups. However, I wanted to share with you a couple of quotes here from participants within the same focus group who presented some really contradictory stereotypes. So, for example, the participant you see here listed as Honduran American participant stated, one day I heard somebody saying that Spanish people are stupid, lazy. And then within the same focus group, as our discussion around stereotypes progressed, another participant who identifies as Cuban American stated, when we hear about Latinos, it's they work really hard in the garden and things like that. So there's this stereotype of being lazy, but on the other hand, working hard, but only in this context of gardening and agriculture. So these were the kinds of very confusing messages that these kids heard quite routinely. We also asked kids about how they coped with the different types of acculturative stress that they experienced. And these were some of the responses. Some responded to communicating with others, being able to talk in their heritage language, like this Chinese American participant who stated, it's good to communicate within my culture, within my own culture. We can talk in our own language. Others talked about the difficulty of sharing their concerns with adults in the school. I hate when referring to guidance counselors, say that when they will keep it private, but then they tell all the teachers. So many concerns about confidentiality. I really wouldn't talk to someone, an adult from school, because that's just weird. So there's this kind of a lack of feeling of connection with some of the adults in the school. However, we had another student who talked about a specific teacher, and she said, I know a teacher, she's a Chinese person, she helps many Asian kids, many Chinese kids, even stays after school if someone comes and asks for help. So while a majority of the students indicated that they didn't feel like they wanted to talk to adults in the school about these concerns, they did find that they had identified a few people that they could reach out to because the teacher or the school personnel had developed sort of a reputation or an understanding for their cultural context. And with regard to parents, we asked them if they would reach out to parents or family members to cope with stress. And this is what one participant stated: I think it just depends on the level of seriousness. If it's something that's pretty small, then I will go to my friends. But if it's something really serious and can affect me or my health or just anything, then I'll probably go to my older brother and my parents. I think because you do not want your parents to get worried about you and concerned about you. So most kids like to keep hiding. And I mostly do not tell my parents how I feel. I just put it in my journal or just let it be. So there's that reluctance to seek help. These are some findings from the study, but I just want to wrap up, with a few thoughts regarding acculturation. And this, oftentimes we wonder, what is the best way then to acculturate? Is there a particular trajectory that's most beneficial? And in fact, what we find is that acculturating to the American or the mainstream American culture is helpful in certain ways. And in other ways, acculturating to the heritage culture may also be helpful. And there's a great deal of individual variation in this. So there's no acculturative trajectory that is the perfect trajectory for all immigrant or foreign-born students. I do want to move to some recommendations that I'd like to suggest based on some of these issues that I've raised regarding acculturation, regarding identity, and the psychological well-being of foreign-born students in our schools in the U.S. And some of these recommendations are based on the study that I talked about earlier with the high school students. And some are based in the broader literature of what we understand in the psychology of immigration. First of all, students typically in our study ask for more safe spaces, both within and outside of the school context, to just talk about their experiences. They found many of them said that they just had no place to talk to about what it was like to be an immigrant, or what it was like to be Chinese American, what it was like to be a Haitian American student. What it meant for them to have parents who didn't communicate in English, and how they would like their particular cultural identities to be known for more than just and beyond stereotypes, that this was not something that they were comfortable with, that they understood that stereotypes were very common, but also misapplied sometimes, and wanting the whole school community to be a part of the process of just building an understanding around immigration and culture. So there's a recommendation around just educating students, other students, parents, guardians, the school community, and as a whole about their adjustment process. Another thing that I would recommend is training for school personnel regarding the impact of immigration, stress, and trauma. Oftentimes, there's many immigrant students have experienced trauma both in the pre-migration context, while they're making a journey into the United States, and within the United States. So there are ways in which the school personnel are often overburdened with enormous amounts of responsibilities and information. But I think that having some training around this process and understanding what some of these trajectories of immigrant kids might be would help the process of understanding and interacting with that student. Another recommendation has to do with increasing access to support. Oftentimes, like I mentioned in those findings, many students didn't know that the supports existed, or that if they did, who would use them and in what circumstances. Like, for example, when would you go see a guidance counselor? When would you see a therapist? When would you talk to a teacher? And oftentimes, the students were not aware of when they could do that, or when it was appropriate to do that, or if they reached out, what kind of help they would receive. And along with that, the parents oftentimes were not aware of these supports either. And lastly, I would say that addressing sociocultural barriers would be important. Thinking about what is the culture of the school, what is the culture of the family and of the student, how is the student trying to negotiate multiple cultural contexts every day on a daily basis, and what can the school and school personnel do, what can parents do to communicate with each other and bridge these kinds of barriers? Because it's not a simple issue. It's not as simple as saying educating a community about mainstream culture or adolescent culture, for example, or what the educational system, but also educating the educators about what some of the experiences of immigrant communities and individuals might be, and finding dialogues, finding ways to bridge across all of these different layers of the broader ecological context of the student. So with that, I hope that this provides some information that could be helpful within the school context as well as outside of the school context. And later I'd be happy to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you.